Creating Depressions, Recessions, and Wars for Profit. Presenting the evidence that the connection between the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War was the desire of the European central banks to force America into the creation of a central bank called the Federal Reserve in 1913. A presentation of Publius Productions. Ralph Epperson is a researcher, historian, and author who has published 4 books and produced 19 DVDs. He has been studying America's history for 50 years and is convinced that this nation's true history has been concealed from the American public. Mr. Epperson has twice been a guest on the History Channel and has lectured all over the United States for some 28 years. He has been the guest on close to 500 talk shows in the past 7 years. 2 of his books have been published in 6 foreign nations, and he was stunned when an independent publisher in Communist China asked for and received permission to publish his book entitled The Unseen Hand in that nation. And just a month ago, he gave permission to a book publisher in Indonesia, basically a Muslim country, to publish the same title. He has said that he was honored to have been included in Victor Thorne's first ever Conspiracy Hall of Fame, along with some of the greatest conspiracy writers of all time, like Anthony Sutton, Jim Marrs, and Commander William Guy Carr.
I want to thank you for coming to hear me this afternoon. It is always a pleasure to speak before a live audience, to bounce my ideas off of you, and to hear your comments. I first spoke to a Paranoia magazine audience maybe 20 years ago when they were on the East Coast, and I welcome the opportunity to do it again today. When you are an internationally recognized author, such as I am, you get invitations to speak all over the world. I recently returned from a speaking engagement in Sweden, and as usual, they provided me with a name tag. They took my name of Ralph Epperson and translated it into Swedish so that many of the attendees would be able to recognize me. And here is that name tag. I was told that it is pronounced Gösta Klutz, but I was reassured that this is the Swedish spelling of the name of Ralph Epperson. Now I know what you're thinking. How could this klutz get selected into the Conspiracy Hall of Fame? Well, stay tuned. You might be able to answer that question by the time I finish. Let me start by briefly defining the 2 views of history. The first is called the accidental view of history, and this view holds that the major events happened by accident for no apparent reason, and that rulers are powerless to prevent them. Things just happen for no determinable cause. The second view is called the conspiratorial view of history, and this view holds that the major events happen by design after years of planning for reasons not generally made known to the public. I first started my research in 1962, a couple of years after my graduation from the University of Arizona. I can assure you that what I believe today was not offered to me in any course I was enrolled in for 4 years of my life. It has come after the reading of over 1,100 books on both sides of this issue, and I would summarize my views today with these words. My research has proven to me that a huge, extremely powerful, worldwide conspiracy has been working to achieve absolute rule over the entire human race by using wars, depressions, inflations, and revolutions to achieve their aims. Let me give you a dictionary definition of the word conspiracy. A conspiracy is two or more people meeting in secret with an evil plan. And the next word I would like to define is the word inflation. It is an increase in the money supply, and it always causes a rise in the price level. So inflation has a cause and an effect. The cause is an increase in the money supply, and the effect is a rise in prices. I would next like to discuss another example of how money can be used to destroy. The word is called hyperinflation, where the supply of money is increased so rapidly to such an extent that it takes millions or even billions of the currency to buy even the most insignificant product. An example of hyperinflation is occurring right now in Zimbabwe, the African nation formerly known as Rhodesia. This is a picture of a Zimbabwean trillionaire holding up a 100 trillion Zim dollar in January 2011. The tourist in Zimbabwe can purchase one for $5 American. That is an example of how money can be used to destroy an economy. There is an opposite word that I would like next to define, and that is the word deflation. A deflation is a decrease in the money supply, causing prices to drop. President James Garfield addressed the issue with this comment: "Whoever controls the volume of money is absolute master of all industry and commerce." In early America, it was the people who controlled the volume of money by discovering gold, which was real money. But there were others who wanted to control the volume of money, and they were called central bankers. And here is why. If you totally control the quantity of money, you can sell when the price is high. Decrease the volume of money to lower prices, and then buy when the prices are at their lowest. And then increase the volume of money to cause prices to rise, and then you can sell and repeat the process. This control enables the bankers to make enormous profits simply by controlling the money supply. So in summary, then, there are only two groups who can have the ability to increase the money supply: either the central bankers or the people. When the people lose the control of the money supply and they print money to put it into the marketplace, it is called counterfeiting, and it is illegal. And those who counterfeit are punished by the government. When the government increases the money supply, it is called funding the deficit, and no one goes to prison. Yes, notice this: the crime is identical to the crime of counterfeiting. It is increasing the money supply with money created out of nothing. Now let me show you who has the control of the volume of money here in the United States. The Federal Reserve provided me a copy of their own book when I attended the University of Arizona and took a class called Money and Banking. It was called the Federal Reserve System, Purposes and Functions, as you can see. And it says this in chapter 1 on page 1. The function of the Federal Reserve System is to foster a flow of credit and money. Now that I've laid down some economic principles, I would now like to start an examination of the history of America. And I would like to urge you to be open and listen to all of the evidence before you reach a verdict, because this information is extremely important to an understanding of just why this nation is in trouble. The first step in the process of creating a central bank occurred shortly after the American Revolution that started in 1776, after we declared our independence from Great Britain. After the revolution ended, the American government was faced with an enormous debt, and a method to solve that crisis was brought into the arena of public debate. There were two able and eloquent nationally known speakers on the subject, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson was opposed to the creation of a national or central bank, and Hamilton was in favor. Thomas Jefferson warned the American people with these words: "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property, until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." But the most prophetic of Jefferson's ideas is this one: "It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. This means we should not borrow to pay the deficits of our government." A principle which, if acted on. Now please listen to how he was warning the future generations in America about the result of borrowing to pay deficits. A principle which, if acted on, would save 1/2 of the wars of the world. This man was warning us, Americans, but we have not listened, and our past has been plagued by wars created by central bankers in their attempts to force us into the creation of a central bank, as you will see as I continue. Simply stated, Jefferson was warning us central bankers cause wars to create debt. After the Constitution was written in 1787, the first government of the United States was created in 1789, with George Washington as the first president. But he appointed Alexander Hamilton the first Secretary of the Treasury, and 2 years later, in 1791, the United States government granted a 20-year charter to the First Bank of the United States. This bank was privately owned, had the power to print paper money, and loan it to the government at interest. The charter ran for its 20-year term and was not renewed by the administration of President James Monroe. But the government had paid off the debt of the American Revolution. So after 1811, the United States had no central bank, so the bankers planned the War of 1812 between England and the United States. They thought that this would convince the Americans to create a permanent central bank. And to solve the national debt created by the expense of this war, the Second Bank of the United States was created in 1816 with a 20-year charter, meaning it would expire in 1836. The renewal of the 20-year charter became a smoldering issue when President Andrew Jackson ran for re-election in 1832. His campaign platform was simple. He ran with this statement: "Jackson and no bank," or "bank and no." He told Martin Van Buren, his vice president, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And sure enough, on January the 30th, 1835, a would-be assassin named Richard Lawrence stepped into his path and fired 2 pistols at him at close range. Fortunately, both weapons misfired and Jackson was unharmed. Lawrence later claimed that he had been, quote, "in touch with the powers in Europe which had promised to intervene if any attempt was made to punish him," unquote. So the central bankers had planned 2 separate wars and still had not created a permanent central bank. But they thought that they had softened America enough that a third war would be sufficient to create the need for a permanent central bank. And they faced the fact that had become evident during the War of 1812. America was building a navy, and this would increase the hazards in supplying any army the Europeans would send to fight another war in America. They realized that the 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the United States had become an insurmountable obstacle. Then they realized that Canada and Mexico were not large enough to attack the United States, but there was an issue that they could utilize to create a war between the states, and that issue was slavery. Slavery. This issue had festered in America ever since it started in the 16th century. The European central bankers started planning a civil war in America, and their plans revolved around an organization they created in 1837 called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Members were sent to the United States to spread secession amongst the states so that it would provoke a war between the North and the South. I've read various estimates of the number of members from a low of 14,000 to a high of 1 million. The next step was the election of Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1860, and he was inaugurated on March the 4th of the next year. The activities of the European bankers were successful, and the Civil War started on April the 12th, 1861. When the South fired on Fort Sumter, a northern fort in South Carolina. And I would now like to give you the Epperson version of what transpired next. I believe the European bankers met with Lincoln and asked him how he was going to pay for the enormous costs of the war. And I believe Lincoln would have said something like, "I don't know. I've got very little taxing power, so I'm in a quandary." And I think the bankers would have said, "Gee, President Lincoln, you're really lucky. We're in the banking business, and we could loan you the money, and you could pay for the costs of the war." And Lincoln, I know, would have said, "At what interest rate?" And the bankers would have said, 36%. And Lincoln then said, don't call me, I will call you." And he issued the greenback dollar. It was, catch this, it was not borrowed and had no gold redemption behind the bill, meaning it was not backed by gold reserves. He issued a total of $450 million of these greenbacks to pay for the costs of the war. In 1963, Congressman Wright Patman, the chairman of the House Banking Committee, asked the Secretary of the Treasury to determine how much money was saved in interest payments by his issuing the greenback. The Secretary of the Treasury responded, "If the money had been borrowed for 100 years, from 1863 to 1962, to reduce the amount of annual payments, the amount of interest paid would have exceeded $49 billion. The amount of interest paid would have exceeded $49 billion. Lincoln printed $450 million in greenbacks, and the interest he saved was $49 billion. Thank you, President Lincoln." So the bankers got the war they wanted, but failed in their attempt to get Lincoln to either borrow from them or create a central bank that they would own. But to give Lincoln credit, he quickly discovered that the central bankers in England and France were supporting the South by sending them the essential weapons of war that could be shipped to the South in exchange for cotton. But Lincoln wisely determined that the quickest way to defeat your enemy was to cut off their supplies. So he imposed a blockade on all of the southern states just a few days later on April the 19th, 1861. This gave rise to the growth of southern blockade runners who were successful in skirting the blockade to bring war essentials into the ports of the South at huge profit. I remember reading somewhere that the South guaranteed a successful blockade runner double the price when they offloaded their cargo. One of the most successful of these blockade runners was Junius Morgan, the father of J.P. Morgan, who made an immense fortune in successful blockade running into the South. This was the base of J.P. Morgan's enormous wealth, and Morgan parlayed it into his being one of the wealthiest men in the United States. But to counter the blockade, the South signed contracts with shipbuilders in England and France to purchase huge ships capable of being so powerful that no northern ship could get close enough to prevent them from visiting their port. And once Lincoln became aware of this, he determined that he needed a naval ally, and one quickly. He looked to other European nations, but he quickly discovered that there was only one European nation without a central bank, and that was the nation of Russia. The nation also had the largest navy at the time, and he arranged for their navy to visit ports in the north and in California as a sign of their support of Lincoln's government. The Russian admirals of these ships had instructions from Tsar Alexander II that they were to be ready to fight any power that chose to run the blockade of the north. One of the evidences of Russia's involvement in the Civil War is this. The city of Baltimore issued this proclamation in October of 1863, welcoming the fleet to the northern ports. A second source is a photograph taken by Matthew Brady, perhaps the greatest photographer of the events of the Civil War. It was taken of the Russian ship called the Osliaba while it was in the port of Alexandria, Virginia. These two sources are part of the documentation for the appearance of the Russian ships in northern ports. You might want to see how many history books on the Civil War even mention this fact. When I did my research for my book, The Unseen Hand, I could find not one. Once the ships showed up in 1863, England and France canceled the contracts, apparently because they considered a war with Russia to be very expensive and fruitless. And the war started to come to an end, and it did on April the 9th, 1865. I would like to take a step out of the chronological sequence of events to discuss an event that happened 2 years later in 1867. After Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president, and 2 years later he received a bill for $7.2 million for the use of the fleet. Johnson had to find a way to give a foreign nation American taxpayers' money. He knew that Congress had no authority to give $1 to a foreign nation, because there's no authority for Congress to give foreign aid to any foreign nation. But he did have one way to accomplish this. He could buy land. America had paid France $15 million in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So Johnson bought land, meaning Alaska, for $7.2 million. See if you can find this in your history books, and I will say you will not find any. Now back to the sequence of events. President Lincoln decided to celebrate the ending of the war by making an appearance in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on the night of April the 14th, 1865. And it was the night that John Wilkes Booth assassinated him. The Secretary of War, Edwin P. Stanton, took charge of the search for Booth and quickly sent troops to the roads out of Washington, D.C. to prevent anyone from leaving the city. There were 8 of them and inadvertently, I am certain, he failed to send troops to the Navy Yard Bridge, which led to Maryland and then to Virginia, a southern state. But certainly, by coincidence, I'm certain that it is the one that Booth took to get out of the city. The president was not the only one scheduled to be assassinated that night. Of course, they planned on assassinating Lincoln, but also three other people. Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and General Ulysses S. Grant. If all of these attempts had been successful that night, it is quite likely that Secretary of War Edwin P. Stanton would have become President of the United States. But the only successful assassination that night was of Abraham Lincoln. Now this might explain why the Navy Yard Bridge was not secured after Lincoln was assassinated. Maybe Stanton could become President of the United States by assisting in the assassination of these four leaders. This is a book entitled The Assassination and History of the Conspiracy by Bert James Lowenberg. It was originally printed only 4 months after the assassination of the president in 1865, and it reported the order, meaning the Knights of the Golden Circle, originated the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Yet I defy you to find one reference to them in nearly any book or textbook you will read about the Civil War. The Knights have been officially buried. So the war ended and the bankers had not succeeded in getting their central bank. So the Knights of the Golden Circle and certain high-ranking members of the Masonic Lodge created the Ku Klux Klan in 1867. And their plan was to create racial riots in the South between the blacks and the whites to foment another civil war. The admitted organizer of the KKK was General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Southern general and a one-time member of the Masonic Lodge. Albert Pike, another Southern general and the leader of the worldwide Masonic movement, became the chief judicial officer of the KKK. Another member of the Masons and of the Knights of the Golden Circle was Jesse James, the famous outlaw. Jesse later became the head of the Knights until it was officially dissolved in 1903. And to conceal their involvement, the Masons who assisted in the formation of the KKK included a code inside the name of the KKK itself. K is the 11th letter of the English language, as you can see by this table. There are 3 K's in the name Ku Klux Klan, and 3 times 11 is obviously 33, a hidden recognition of the 33rd degree of Masonry, just another coded example of their involvement in our lives. Just like so many facts in this case, the truth was there for all those who cared enough to discover it themselves. All of this documentation of these statements is contained in my DVD entitled Jesse James Lived to be 103. The Second Civil War never came off, and I am still not certain as to why it did not. I can find no explanation from any historian on this issue. So the road to a permanent central bank in the United States did not come as a result of a war. Each of these 3 wars had not been able to get the American government to create a central bank, so the bankers changed their strategy. They created bank runs in 1873, 1893, and 1907, each one to convince the American people that bankers were not honest and America needed a central bank. I think it is now important to give you a simple explanation of what a bank run is to show you how the international bankers used them as a way of convincing the American people that America needed a central bank. Let's just say that 9 of my friends and I decide to create a bank that we're going to call the last bank of Tucson, here in Tucson, Arizona. We didn't have any money for capital improvements, but we did get a great price on the rental of this magnificent building. We thought it was a nice touch that the building had a covered walkway where we could get our horses out of the sun when we went into the bank to conduct our business. We each contributed $1,000, so our beginning capital was $10,000. Let's just say that each of us goes into the bank a year later to withdraw our $1,000, but none of us knew the others were going to do that as well. The bank manager that we hired would tell each of us that he could not honor any of our individual requests because he simply did not have the money on hand. He would explain that, like any other bank, he had made loans to others who needed the money. We would insist that he call the individuals he loaned the money to and ask them to return the money he had loaned them. The manager would say that each of those individuals would say that they no longer had the money because they had given it to someone else and that they in turn didn't have it any longer either for the same reason. This is called a bank run, when a bank does not have the money on hand to pay all of the depositors at the same time. The reason is simple. Bankers make loans from the money their depositors have placed in a savings account. That means that a bank normally only has a small percentage of the deposited money on hand at any one time. If the story of what happened in Tucson got out to other depositors in America, that a local bank was denying their depositors their money, many other citizens would race to their bank to withdraw their money because they thought their bank could also be insolvent. And when they did, they would discover that their bank also had made loans and didn't have the money any longer either. This would start a nationwide bank run. And the international bankers would then declare that all of these local banks were being run by a bunch of crooks, and what this nation needed would be, guess what, America? A central bank. America needs a central bank. As I've said, bank runs have happened at least 3 times in America's past after the Civil War, in 1873, 1893, and 1907. This is a photograph taken during the bank run of 1907, when all of these depositors came to the Knickerbocker Bank in New York City demanding their money, and the bank had admitted that they no longer could honor their requests. And when J.P. Morgan, the nation's leading banker at the time, suggested that a central bank was needed, the American people allowed the international bankers to create the Federal Reserve banking system in 1913. And the fact that it was international banker J.P. Morgan who had started the rumor that the Knickerbocker Bank was insolvent when he knew it wasn't, was quickly buried in the turmoil created during the bank run of 1907. So in 1913, the international bankers finally got what they wanted: a privately owned bank that had the power to print paper money out of nothing, loan it to the government at interest. It is called the Federal Reserve, but it is not federal. We know that for certain, that it is privately owned, but we just do not know who owns it. So I'm hoping that you can see that there was a common thread through the period of 1776 to 1913. The need of the European central bankers to create a permanent central bank in America. There were very few in Congress who spoke out in opposition to the creation of the Federal Reserve, but one was Congressman Charles Lindbergh, the father of the so-called aviator by the same name. He expressed his concerns about this act with these strong words: "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill," he's talking about President Woodrow Wilson, "the invisible government," notice he called it the invisible government by the money power will be legitimized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. I'm going to repeat that because of the importance of what he was saying. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. And to show that the congressman's predictions were correct, America suffered through two Great Depressions shortly after the Federal Reserve was created. The first was in 1920, and the second was in 1929. It is interesting that most Americans have heard of the crash of 1929, but few, if any, know anything about the crash of 1920, and there is a very important reason why. This is the fall 2009 edition of a magazine called the Intercollegiate Review, called a Journal of Scholarship and Opinion. And this is an article starting on page 22 entitled Warren G. Harding and the Forgotten Depression of 1920. I would like to quote several brief paragraphs from this article because there is an important lesson contained therein. The article starts, the economic situation in 1920 was grim. By that year, unemployment had jumped from 4% to nearly 12%. The gross national product had declined 17%. But in November of that year, Warren G. Harding was elected President of the United States. The article continues. In his 1920 accepting speech of the Republican presidential nomination, Harding declared, We will strike at government borrowing which enlarged the evil, and we will attack the very high cost of government with every energy. We promise to attend to the halting of waste and extravagance. It will be an example to stimulate thrift and economy in private life. President Harding cut the government's budget nearly in half between 1920 and 1922. Tax rates were slashed for all income groups. The national debt was reduced by 1/3. By the late summer of 1921, just a few months after he was elected, signs of recovery were already visible. He was inaugurated in early 1921, and just a few months later, signs of recovery were already visible. The following year, unemployment was back down to 6.7% and was only 2.4% by 1923. Notice this. These actions taken by President Harding solved the Depression in about a year, maybe two. Now I would like to reveal the real reason for the Depression of 1920. The banking families wanted to force Henry Ford, the automobile maker, into borrowing money to operate his business. Ford had ingeniously created a strategy to avoid the need to borrow money. He supplied his dealers with the cars they could sell without payment until they were sold. Secondly, he kept the prices low enough that the average American could afford one, and he paid his employees more than the going wage for car assemblers. To the bankers, this situation was intolerable. They had to force him into a position of having to need borrowed money to run his business. Now, this is the interesting thing about this activity of the central bankers. Someone must have told Henry Ford that it was the Jewish bankers that had tried to bankrupt him so that he needed to borrow. Apparently someone also provided him with a copy of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, and he read them and believed the Jews were out to control the world. He purchased the Dearborn, Michigan Independent newspaper, and he used it as a way of educating its readers about the